The actions we take in games can create powerful spaces for us to connect to the world and to connect with deeper parts of ourselves. Some of these strong narratives can really resonate within us, giving us an opportunity to process everything from joy and success to grief, heartbreak, and loss. Our next speaker previously worked with Meta and now working with her indie company Sondering Studio is a writer who believes in using games to make players cry. In a good way. Please welcome Emily Pitcher.
Hi, I'm Emily, and today I'm going to teach you how to make video games that make your players cry, specifically how to approach topics such as grief, loss, and identity in a sensitive yet meaningful way. Firstly, who am I? I'm the founder and writer of Sondering Studio, creating heartfelt narrative games with a focus on Asian American representation. I previously made A Taste of the Past, a narrative side-scroller about May, a young girl overcoming the loss of her mother through cooking Chinese food. It was even featured in last year's Game Devs of Color Expo, Polygon, and Business Insider. I've been featured in the Game Awards, Future Class, Malala Fund, and Code Coven's Solstice program. I'm also a game dev content creator. I make videos on Instagram and YouTube about my favorite games, my journey as a game developer, and the occasional meme. Games are for escape. So why do so many people gravitate towards games depicting their real life struggles? Indie games like What Remains of Edith Finch to AAA games like League of Legends deal with difficult subjects like complicated families and loss. So let's hear it from the players themselves. Here is a review of my game, A Taste of the Past. I lost my dad to cancer when I was 13. He was my best friend. I felt like I needed to play this tonight. Finding this gem almost felt like a message from him as well. Thank you for this. Here is a review of Before Your Eyes, a narrative adventure game that uses your real life blinks to jump in and out of your memories. As someone who has experienced a chunk of this life, I immediately had a breakdown near the end. It reminded me that I should be thankful for the life I already lived. From the bottom of my heart, thank you. And finally, here is a review of Spiritfarer, a cozy management game about taking care of the dying. I played this game at a time where my sister's terminal cancer was beginning to win. As emotionally difficult as it has been, this game has been like having someone hold my hand as I start to let my sister go. Games allow us to find closure, to know we're not alone in our hardship, and to gain purpose. Games are more than a way to pass time. They tell beautiful stories that can stay with us forever. They give us renewed purpose and help us deal with our real life struggles. After taking some time off school for my health, I played Night in the Woods, a narrative adventure game about May Borowski, who returns to her small town after dropping out of college. At the time, I was struggling with my physical and mental health. I felt uncomfortable in my hometown with all my friends no longer living there. I had no idea what I was doing with my life. Night in the Woods made me feel less alone. It gave me hope at a time I thought my struggles were going to be permanent. It's also what inspired me to take the leap of faith and start making video games, which is why I'm here today. Well, why does any of this matter? This is Game Devs of Color Expo. Many of the characters in our games have diverse backgrounds and may face issues of cultural identity. My game, A Taste of the Past, examines how family and food are how May connects to her Chinese heritage. On a broader scale, we want our games to touch people. We make games to delight, to comfort, to challenge. If you're a developer looking to create games that resonate with people, here is my advice. The plot in A Taste of the Past centers around the loss of May's mother, but I haven't lost a parent. I was still able to convey such a touchy subject in a believable way. So how did I do it? This brings me to my first tip: research. To prepare for a taste of the past, I read books, watched TED Talks, looked at social media, and visited online articles of people who had gone through a death in the family. You can talk to people who have gone through similar struggles, read poetry, and listen to podcasts. After watching a talk about how the stages of grief don't necessarily line up to a person's experiences, I had May's great grandmother say, "We have the stages of grief to guide us, but grief doesn't know it's supposed to be linear." There is no one way to process loss. Sometimes just acknowledging how messy emotions can be is enough. Obviously, you shouldn't exploit people's honest accounts of their struggles, but listening to people who have gone through similar hardships can expand your perspective. Don't know where to start? Some of my favorite books about loss are Crying in H Mart by Michelle Zauner, When the Stars Are Scattered by Victoria Jameson and Omar Mohammed, I'm Glad My Mom Died by Jeanette McCurdy, The Kite Runner by Khaled Hosseini, and The Sky is Everywhere by Janny Nelson. My favorite books about identity are Almost American Girl by Robin Ha, Loveless by Alice Oseman, Simon versus the Homo sapiens Agenda by Becky Albertalli, and The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas. Research doesn't even have to mean outside materials. It can also mean thinking about similar experiences in your life that relate to the subject matter. For example, a difficult breakup. For A Taste of the Past, I thought about times my grandma cooked for me and disagreements I've had with my mother. I reflected on times where people who were once close to me became strangers. I make games about complicated families, cultural identity, and loss. Those are some pretty heavy topics, and it's important I convey them with sensitivity and complexity. That's why I go directly to the source, either myself, who has personal experience, or others who have. If you're dealing with a culture or experience that doesn't match your own, I would highly recommend involving a cultural consultant who can give you feedback on ways to tell your story in a more accurate way, early into the writing process, and beta sensitivity readers who can edit your work for perceived offensive content, stereotypes, and bias. Ultimately, I would recommend having a writer on your team of that background, but what's most important is having that identity involved in the creative process. Cultural consultants do work. In the TV show BoJack Horseman, one of the main characters, Todd, comes out as asexual, what many believe to be one of the best depictions of asexuality in media. And it worked because they had an ace woman consultant advocate for experiences and identity. We need diverse people in leadership positions because they are the most likely to advocate for hiring for these roles and push for better, more inclusive stories. Even if you're not in a leadership position, you can encourage hiring diverse writers and consultants. My second tip is the more specific you can be, the better. Instead of describing emotions plainly, such as, I feel excited, sad, joyful, bored, describe emotions with specificity, such as, I feel like it's the night before a field trip and there's so much anticipation, I can barely fall asleep. Everyone knows that hardship makes people sad. So to write with nuance, it's better for our characters to describe their experiences rather than simply stating their emotions. In A Taste of the Past, the main character's mother's death is introduced in the first scene. Instead of having her tell each NPC that she's sad, I wrote about the awkwardness of shopping for a funeral dress and feeling disconnected to her classmates with ideal families. In my game, May says, my mom's funeral was last week. I took my sister to the mall to shop for a black dress, and it was so weird. Like, what am I supposed to say when the sales associate asks me, looking for anything in particular today? And it's not just that. Who's going to take me to 99 Ranch? Who's gonna watch scary movies with me? Part of me doesn't want to be happy because that will mean I've accepted her death. That packs a much greater punch than if she said, I'm feeling distressed with my mom gone, and makes your writing feel less cliche. There's a writing tip that I live by. In any piece of writing, put at least one thing about yourself in it that is shameful. If you want to create a game that will move someone, you'll have to confront your innermost self too. Embrace your embarrassing moments and your vulnerability. In A Taste of the Past, I put in the part of myself who craves acceptance, my complicated relationship with my family, and my internal struggle of creativity and stability. I wrote about my favorite foods growing up and folding dumplings with my grandma on Sundays. My friends make fun of me for making everything I write a self insert, but that's truly how I make games that feels so personal. I translate my hopes and dreams, my biggest fears, to whatever my characters are going through. My third tip is the importance of hope. Don't shy away from the ugly truth of the character's struggles, but sometimes we need levity to have the emotional moments hit even harder. We don't necessarily need to have a happy ending to uplift our audience, but we can insert pockets of humor. Near the end of A Taste of the Past, after May discusses her grief, I wrote a flashback scene to when she and her mom made soup dumplings. The scene is silly and heartfelt, but effective when juxtaposed to the main character's final monologue accepting her mother's passing. Even though Night in the Woods is about May's struggle with mental health, there are scenes where she goes to band practice and engages in the world's silliest knife fight with her friend Greg. Even though Before Your Eyes tells a heartbreaking story about family and first love, there is a scene where the main character plays video games with his next door neighbor Chloe. Essentially, games, just like life, are filled with ups and downs. You need both to feel each side to the fullest. When writing about cultural issues, it can be tempting to fall into stereotypes and tropes. Speaking as a Chinese person, I frequently see comments of East Asians complaining that Asian stories always tell the same narrative of bringing stinky food to school lunches. You still want to capture your personal experiences, though. So, how do you portray it in a way that feels fresh? Referring back to the stinky food trope, the reason it's so frequently used is that Asian people often feel isolated from others due to something we cannot control, our culture's food. While the trope initially resonated with many Chinese people not living in China, it soon became overused, and some even thought it was gimmicky. In my first game, I actually wrote about this experience, and a review called it simple, predictable, and cringe to play. In A Taste of the Past, I took a similar idea, the distinctness of Chinese food, but instead, I wrote about the joy of eating longevity noodles on your birthday and lychee jellies as a kid. And now people review my game. Was not ready to cry today, but maybe it's just what I needed. As for how you can implement this into your game, you can approach the same subject with a different perspective, as I did earlier, or convey the same emotion using a different scenario. Instead of using the stinky food trope to convey feeling isolated from others, a writer portraying a Chinese American story could talk about visiting your home country and feeling in between two cultures. The topic of this talk is making games that make people cry, but that doesn't mean writing about sad topics like racism. Celebrating the details of one's culture can really resonate with others, such as the smell of youtiao in the morning, receiving hongbao from your grandparents, and eating mooncakes during the Mid-Autumn Festival. Considering how negative the outside world and media can be, focusing on the joyous parts of a culture can be refreshing. A couple of games that do this masterfully are Venba, a narrative game about cooking Indian food, and A Space for the Unbound, a slice of life adventure game set in rural Indonesia about a girl and boy with supernatural powers. As I mentioned in my earlier tip, moments of levity can sometimes be the most powerful. Writing about your culture is a tricky subject because, while there are similarities, no one story can represent everyone. This is why, instead of relying on tropes, I like to write about my personal experiences, whether or not I think other Asians relate to them. In A Taste of the Past, I wrote about taking art classes as a kid, begging my mom to take me to our neighborhood pool, and going to 99 Ranch as an adult. Instead of appealing to the widest audience, it's more important to tell your story or a particular story in the best way. Even if someone's experience may not match your own, they can still relate. I frequently get comments on A Taste of the Past from non-Chinese people saying parts of this story reminded them of their families and culture. At the end of the day, no matter what ethnicity you are, culture is meant to bring people together. That's why stories about how people connect are so powerful. At Sondering Studio, we don't want our games to only appeal to a Chinese audience or always tell a distinctly Chinese story. For us, what's most important is we tell a story that we're passionate about where the characters happen to be Chinese. Especially in the recent Stop Asian Hate movement, we want to make games that bridge the gap between diverse players. Even though awareness around mental health is finally growing, it's still heavily stigmatized. In the media, it's often portrayed as beautiful, almost like something that makes you special. The reality is depression, anxiety, PTSD, etc., can be very ugly. It can ruin relationships and make it difficult to communicate with those you love. May, in A Taste of the Past, is confronting her grief head on. For her, depictions of mental illness and similar struggles, it's important to show those ugly parts. This is not to say to make those struggling with mental health villains, but you don't want your players to come out with misconceptions about how mental illness works. While May appreciates her mom and accepts her passing at the end, she spends a lot of time grappling with her complicated feelings about her mother. May acknowledges her mother is not perfect. She has trouble letting some of that go and processing her mother's death. Mental health is especially stigmatized in Asian families. May talks to a bunch of her ancestors in my game. It was important for me to have an ancestor present a perspective I've experienced personally. May's great-great-grandfather, instead of comforting her in what is obviously a difficult time, says, "You need to take care of your sister. Your mom can't be there for you two anymore. Your grandma made sure you could have a better life in America, and you shouldn't throw that away because your mom is gone. Your dad has to pay for your art classes by himself now. Haven't you considered that?" As for other quick thoughts on mental health, don't portray suicide in detail. Keep in mind that mental health is a journey and not a destination, and use sensitivity beta readers if necessary. What is my writing process for an emotional scene? I have pretty simple outlines for my games, usually 2 to 3 sentences per scene, and maybe a quote I want to include in the scene somewhere. Personally, I don't create extensive character sheets of their every like and dislike. What's most important is what do they want and why can't they have it? Oftentimes, I have a scene in a movie, an excerpt from a book, or even a quote nearby to get me in the headspace of the scene. My first draft is to simply convey the emotions. This character is sad because this terrible thing has happened. My first draft might read something like, I am torn up because of what happened. I write just to have something on the paper. I then will essentially rewrite the entire scene, capturing the same emotions, but with greater specificity. That same sentence might turn into, every time I pass by that piano, I realize what once filled me with comfort now brings me shame. Now that he's gone, do I have it in myself to play again? I identify what parts to rewrite by asking myself, could anyone have said this? Or could only this character have said this? Especially when you're writing a scene you really want to hit emotionally, you want your characters' voices to be distinct. My third draft is about making the writing sound human. I know I just advocated for specificity, but sometimes that can result in unnatural sounding dialogue. I will undo some of my edits and make my language simpler to mimic how people naturally speak. The reality is, people aren't perfect storytellers, especially when describing complicated emotions of grief and identity. I highly encourage writers, especially those writing dialogue, to read your work out loud. Even better, have someone on your team read it out loud to you. This has greatly helped me identify lines that sound too pedantic and humanize my dialogue. Anytime you cringe when you hear a certain line, you can mark it as a section you need to revisit. Writing is rewriting. Now, I've talked about why we make emotional games, some strategies for writing, and how to approach certain topics. But really, how do we make our players cry? It doesn't matter what culture you're from or your background, people have an innate desire to feel connected. We want to be loved. We want acceptance from ourselves and others. We want to belong despite the shameful parts of ourselves. What makes people cry is when our writing touches on these feelings in a raw yet insightful way. In A Taste of the Past, May goes through a journey of feeling disconnected from others to feeling connected. In the beginning, she talks about feeling awkward around her classmates with her mom gone. Everyone in class already walks on eggshells around me. Someone came up to me to ask if I was okay, and I was like, no, I'm just a kid. And now my mom's dead. Then they started crying. And I started comforting them, even though I'm the one with the dead mom. They were like, I can't imagine what I'd do if my mom died, but I don't have to imagine. Every holiday, when I get married, when people ask what my parents do, I'm going to be reminded. By the end, once she has accepted her mother's passing, she says, I don't know how things are going to change, but I'll keep painting. I'll help Dad take care of Amy. I'll take everything you've given me and continue to love our family. I'm hopeful for the future, and all it took was a taste of the past. It doesn't matter if your game is The Last of Us, which is about escaping a zombie apocalypse, or Grease, which is about a woman dealing with loss who learns how to add color back in her life. Most games that hit you emotionally touch on our desire to connect. In The Last of Us, Joel, who struggles to connect with others, finds solace in taking care of a young girl, Ellie. In Grease, the woman learns to accept losing a loved one. For A Taste of the Past, players are initially hit with the harsh reality that May has felt unloved since her mother's passing. Perhaps she's felt unloved even before that. Most of the game is about how desperate she is to connect with her culture. So when May finally achieves self-acceptance and wants to return to her family with a renewed perspective, that joy, that relief of loving her family again is what makes players cry. The pain of taking away love and the comfort of love returning after a period of darkness are what makes players go from, I like this game, to This is a game that will stay with me forever. In the case of my game, May has love taken away from her. But despite that, she realizes that she's had love around her all this time. Even though I make games about my Chinese upbringing, I want people of all backgrounds to play and reach some sense of understanding with my characters. A Taste of the Past is a story about cooking Chinese food, but it's also a game about feeling isolated from those around you and coming to terms with losing someone you love, experiences everyone can relate to. It doesn't matter what subject you're writing about or who you're writing about, we all want to feel love. If you want to make a game that makes people cry, write something that evokes the same emotion of being a kid and feeling for the first time that maybe you don't belong. Write about the relief of finding love after heartbreak. Write about someone who you thought was going to be in your life forever suddenly leaving. Write about your first love, your first loss, person you'd rather not talk about. Writing about difficult subjects can hurt personally. Writing is a vulnerable, scary process, especially if you're writing about your personal experiences. It can spur uncomfortable feelings. Obviously, this is a talk about tips on how to improve your writing, but I wanted to quickly touch on how this can affect you as a writer. The reason I enjoy writing games about real life struggles is that I get to bear my secrets, my greatest hopes and fears to the world in the guise of a video game. I love having a personal connection to my players and reading heartfelt reviews. That being said, it's pretty scary to release a project with so much of myself and potentially touchy subjects in it. If people don't like the game, does that mean they don't like me? Not everyone is meant to like your game, and that's okay. John Green wrote the best-selling American novel of 2014, The Fault in Our Stars. Only 2% of Americans read that book. When I get scared that my story is too niche or doesn't have mass market appeal, I think to myself, I only need this to resonate with my 2%. Other than that, I'd also recommend relying on the support of your other studio members. Reading negative reviews can bring you down. And in those times, confiding in my team, knowing I'm not alone has really helped. Therapy can also help you vocalize how you're feeling. In a way, improving your writing skills while also improving your mental health. Finally, why do we make emotional games? Earlier, I referenced a review of the game Before Your Eyes, which is written by Graham Parks. He gave a talk last year at GDC and shared the writing process for such an emotional game, mainly his realization that to make Before Your Eyes so moving, he had to let go of the best version of the story and instead tell his version of the story. That's when he started writing about his experience growing up with chronic illness, which you will experience if you play the game. His team, which had once been fighting, read his new writing. For the first time in a long time, they were united. Ultimately, we make games for the same reason we play them: to make sense of our complicated lives, to create characters we wish we had growing up, to remind ourselves what is truly important in life. I make games to connect with people who feel that their stories are underrepresented and to uplift others when all seems hopeless. I make games because I know what it's like to sit back after finishing a life-changing game, knowing I will never be the same after playing that. I make games to comfort, to challenge, to delight. To end off, here is a review from A Taste of the Past. Last year, I lost someone who was like my older brother. I had known him for almost 6 years at that point. A couple months after turning 18, he left me, his fiance, and friends behind. He introduced me to so many of the small things I do daily, encouraged me to read, practice my singing. Some of the lines I read and listened to were like he was messaging and talking to me again in a different voice. I think of him daily. I'll never stop. His birthday is in a couple of days. I'll make plans to see his fiance, and I'll share his longevity noodles with her, his recipe before he left. This right here is why I make the games I do. Thank you so much for listening to this talk. If you have comments or questions, you can email Emily@sonderingstudio.com. Here are my socials in case you missed them in the beginning.
Listen, I love a good, mechanically focused roguelike as much as the next person, but the games that have had the biggest impact on me are the ones that have helped me process the world outside of the game itself. And I think some of those experiences have made me cry. I hope more of you out there in the audience feel empowered to bring some of those feels to your games as well, and maybe yourself in the process too. Don't forget that hope, but also be willing to embrace that vulnerability. Thank you for sharing your insights, Emily.